So thanks everybody for coming. We're the Mount Vernon Historic Preservation Commission. I have 4 of us here today. And so Ed is going to start us off. He'll do the intro on porches and overview.
Okay,
Thanks,
Ed.
Ed.
Sure. All right, and I apologize on the handout. I didn't do the secondary printing is extremely small, so if you might need your reading glasses to do it. All right, I'm going to cover a little bit on the history and style of porches and what you see in Mount Vernon, and of course Duane is going to cover how to fix that porch if it needs some work. But let's start off why we have porches in the first place. One of them is to help identify the entrance to the house. Otherwise it'd be quite plain and add some aesthetic appeal to it. Contrary to like Frank Lloyd Wright, who a lot of times liked to hide his entries. You almost had to walk around the house to figure out how to get in. That's a relatively new phenomenon, but in the early American days and in Victorian era period, we wanted to actually know where the entrance is at. Obviously, if it projects out enough, it provides some protection for the people who are standing there waiting to get in, and then prior to air conditioning and that type of thing, the porch was an outdoor living space for many people. That's why you see the big porches, the big wraparound porches. It was a place where you could, in a hot summer evening, you sit out on the porch and you wave at your neighbors as they're walking their dog or driving by in their buggy. In this day and age with cars and that kind of thing, socially the porches don't have the same import as what they once did. But certainly back in the early days, they were a social place as well as a place to cool off in the summertime for air conditioning. And Duane may cover some of this, but you know, if you're trying to restore your porch, or even if the porch has been torn off and you want to research what should go back on there, there's several places or ways to do that. One is obviously if you've got photographic evidence somewhere, that's a great spot to try to find out what that porch might have looked like. And you know, people didn't go around taking pictures of porches per se, so you don't have that kind of record. But what happened is, you know, you took a picture of Grandma Elsie and she happened to be standing on the porch, and so that gives you an opportunity to find out what it actually did look like. So research photographs for one thing, and also an evidence of earlier porch, and this happened out in my old brick house out in the country. They put on a Victorian porch, but it was really a Georgian and early house, and I could tell it was different because you could see where they painted the old columns and the paint had spilled over onto the brick, so you could tell, okay, that's what was there. And a lot of you have that on wood frame homes too. If it's been sided, that's probably been hidden, or if it's been re-sided, you wouldn't know that. But a lot of times there's evidence as to where the porch was if you had one. At least you know what's the extent of it was. And then also, whoops, got a typing error there. The period or style of the house can also give you a little bit of an indication of what kind of porch might have been there in the earlier days. So we're talking about earlier porches. This is like in a Georgian or colonial era. The early porches are the Georgian and colonial style, but you see this one, it really wasn't even a porch. It was just an identification of entry. Now that wouldn't protect anyone who was coming up there from rain or the elements, but it did provide the element. And then as we got a little older, here's another porch that is still in that style or era of house, but it actually projects out from the house, identifies the entry, it would provide some degree of protection for people as they were trying to get into the house or waiting or knocking on the door, that type of thing. This would have very little value as a social interaction place, because that didn't come later until the Victorian era. So now we get into the Victorian era porches, and these are all examples of Mount Vernon. If you ever get a chance just to drive around Mount Vernon, you'll find great examples. I have to call them down to get the ones that I want to display. And I'll refer back also, we used to have a celebration, or what do we call it?
Pleasure, of course.
Pleasure of Porches. We had an event, and we had it for about 6 years, and each time we pick an area of the one quadrant of the town and have events on porches and architectural tours and that type of thing. We haven't done that for a while, but that was a great opportunity to see porches. So here's one that's just basically an entry porch. It provides some cover, 1 or 2 chairs if you want to sit on it, and it has a gable-end roof projecting out, and then which is fairly typical. And then as you get wider, you have what I call a partial porch. It doesn't run all the way across the house, but it provides more outdoor space than the previous version. So this is a partial porch, and that's a typical, they almost always have very low-pitched roofs. A lot of times they're hip roofs, which means you see 3 sides of it, although occasionally you see a gable-in porch. Here's what I call a full porch. This goes all the way across the facade of the house. Usually they stop about 1 foot or 2 short of the edge, and that eliminates that unusual corner where if you have the roof projecting on, then how do you terminate the roof? This takes care of that problem. But this has all the elements. This has, interesting one here, it has triple columns or double columns depending on where you're located. Now I'll talk about the columns in just a second. And of course, the favorite of everyone, the wraparound porch. This is Guy's house, and it gives, you can imagine in the old days how people would probably gather on a porch like this. You probably could have half the neighborhood on there. But it wraps all the way around the house, and I think there's doors on each end, multiple entrances to the house. But it's a great example of a wraparound porch. And here's another one. It's not a full wraparound, but it's a partial wraparound. And they've screened in part of it too, which in Iowa this time of the year, screening a porch in makes a lot of sense. The mosquitoes and things like that can be quite bad. And another wraparound porch that wraps around, and then this one has a projecting entrance. So sometimes even when you have a big porch, you need to identify where the entrance to the porch is. And this one does that here, and then actually you can't see it, but over on the far left-hand side, it's hidden, but we provided some additional stairs so you don't have to walk all the way around to get out of the porch. Now, we'll talk about columns on porches. Now, you can see this one probably needs some repair too, but this is the close-up of the one I showed you earlier, this one here. But columns really, most of what we see today, except for the turn column, dates back from the classical period with the Greeks and Romans. And the Greeks they really identified different parts of the column. The capital is at the very top, the base down to below, and then the column itself. And this one is plain, but on the one on the right, you see what's called a flute in the column. It's something that added more to the verticality of the post. And if you look very close on those, and this is a perspective thing, but you see it looks like it narrows just a little bit as it gets to the top. And that was a trick that the architects and builders back in Greek times used to accentuate the height of the column. If you look up, it would look like it would get smaller anyway, just because of perspective. But they would make the column a little narrower at the top, so it accentuated the height of that porch or that element. And here you've got another thing to point out here, both of these. You have typically columns out at the edge of the porch, but at the house itself, a lot of times they had what they call a half column. In other words, that provided the termination at the house itself. So you have a full column and then a half column. Here's another one. This is your half column, fluted column. Another thing is that most of the time the columns go all the way down to the deck, but not always. I mean, here's one where they actually have raised it up quite a bit, and the height starts there. Now on the left here, you see a more traditional column in the Victorian area, and that's what I call the turned column. It's been turned out on a lathe somewhere, and you can still buy some today, but you have to look for them pretty hard. This is the dimensions of this. This is typically about a 5.5-inch dimension. A 4x4, in many cases, depending on the size of your porch, won't look big enough if you get a 4x4 trim post. So keep in mind the scale of the porch. And other shapes, again, here's a pretty fancy square wood column, and they went so far, there's probably a column inside that, and then they clad it with this, but it needs to have a panel, or an impressed or an indented panel on the facade of it. But again, it's got the capital, it's got the base, and of course the main part of the column itself. Roof types, I said typically a hip roof, like the one on the upper right, but you also occasionally see one on the left. That's really kind of a combination of a gable end roof, and then they put another gable on it. It's a much higher pitch than what you typically see. Usually porch roofs are between 212 and a 312 slope. That's the amount of vertical per, in 12 inches it varies, it's 2 or 2.5 or 3. That can present some problems when you get really shallow like that, because if you get snow sitting on the roof and it doesn't come off in the springtime, you get ice dams and things like that. So if you're going to put a low pitched roof on, which you really should have, you might want to consider an ice dam material underneath the shingles so that any water that gets in there won't damage things. Here's another type of roof form. This was very popular in the period bungalow style, where the porch itself is actually encompassed in the main roof of the house, as opposed to being something that was added on later. But this is fairly typical. We have several houses like that in Mount Vernon, where the main roof of the house actually encloses the porch as well as the house itself. And then we have the projecting, I showed you a picture of that earlier, but here's a projecting gable on what otherwise is a hip roof all the way through, except where they want to accentuate the entry and then they went to a gable end. Materials. Most Victorian era porches, for their ceilings, they had what was called a beaded ceiling board. It's a tongue and groove. It comes in about a 4-inch piece. There's 2 grooves for each board there. But that was fairly typical for Victorian era porches or large porches. It was a fairly inexpensive material. It covered a lot of space. You also see it, we also called it wainscoting at time also, use it for wainscoting, but it's really a beaded ceiling board. And when you paint your porch, generally speaking, you should paint it a light color. Light blue is probably the dominant color, because they wanted it to feel like you're looking up at the sky, even though you're on a porch. And the color of the roof can, I see, were you having a disagreement over what color?
No, ours used to be like a rust orange.
Oh, no.
Just
Terrible.
repainted it.
We painted it blue because I wanted it to go to the sky.
We're good. You made the right decision. Now, porch floors are a little different story. First of all, they should slope away from the house about 1 to 3 inches. I was driving around years ago in Cedar Rapids, and I could see an old Victorian house, and they must have thought that their porch was sinking because they had taken it and jacked it up so it was level. Now, that's the worst thing you can do. It doesn't allow the water to drain off, number one, and number two is if you're putting that much pressure on it, you're probably pulling the structure loose at the house too. So if it looks like it's sagging a little to the outside, that's the way it's supposed to be. That way the water will drain off. And another thing about that is that the grooves on the boards, it means you've got to alter the structure, but the grooves should be parallel to the slope. Otherwise, every time water hits a groove, if you're going the other way, it stops it and pushes it down inside. They make a treated flooring board, but this is one place where I would vary. They make the synthetic wood would make an excellent porch floor. You just want to make sure you get the right scale. Because of all the things in porches, I suppose the bottom of the column is probably the first thing to go, but not long after that, the porch floor is one of the things to go. And again, painting that, usually a gray. You got more latitude in terms of painting the floor than you do the ceiling, if you want to be appropriate. Another thing about porches is the ornamentation, and this is a balustrade on the top, and then of course the skirt on the bottom. And you'll find there's many different types of skirts. If you drive around Mount Vernon, you'll probably find 20 or 25 different designs that were used on the skirt. This is a very simple one, and actually I kind of like it because you have a simple square balustrade on the top, and then they kind of repeated the square vertical shape on the bottom, which looks kind of nice. I would recommend, if you're building these things, is you make them in panels so that they can be removed and painted and repaired. If you build it into the porch itself, then if something starts to rot or something, then you got to tear the whole thing off, and that's a pain. But if you put them together in panels and put them up, it'll save you a lot of time. This is another one. Like I said, you see a lot of different variations in skirts and balustrades. You see turned rods, you see fancy ones like this, which are just still flat, but they've got a cutout on them. And the same thing goes for the skirt below it. Now, ornamentation, most of this doesn't do anything other than add visual interest to the structure. And you see on the top, you have corner brackets at the columns, that's typical. And everything else is really just applied ornament. It doesn't serve any purpose other than aesthetic visual interest. And on the left here, you see another porch that's got a lot of different things going on, the spindle work. It doesn't carry any weight, it's just an aesthetic element. And here you see the turn column with a bracket there. It's different kinds of brackets. Oh, and we're wrapping up. This is a source. Vintage Woodworks is one place where you can actually buy new versions of this. I mean, the ideal thing would be to have, if you've got an old porch and you've got some pieces that are bad on it, you should use those as templates to build the replacement parts. Just like with windows, our first approach is to try to save what's there. You know, just because there's a few rotten pieces doesn't mean the entire porch needs to be cut off and replaced with wrought iron, which I've seen that before. But anyway, this is Vintage Woodworks. They've got a website. You can get on there and see what they've got. But there are other sources of this kind of material also. And then the last thing, building codes. A modern house, if you've got a rail on a porch, first of all, if it's less than 18 inches above the ground, you really don't need a rail. We'll verify that with your local building code. And then rail heights typically have to be 36 inches. But you'll find that on historic homes, seldom does that happen. Usually they may be as low as 2 feet. And if you've got a historic home, like in Mount Vernon, if you're in one of the historic districts and you want to restore your rail, etc., you can actually get by without doing it to 36-inch height. It's a historic exception. But we had to argue that quite a bit initially because the building code people wanted to take this nice old short rail and put a 36-inch rail. It totally changes the scale of the porch. And then the other thing, which you probably should maintain, is the baluster spacing, or the gaps between the balustrades or at the bottom should be a 4-inch maximum. That's the building code, and that one probably makes some sense. So that's the end of the background, and et cetera. Now Duane will take over if he can get his computer up and running.
Thanks a lot for coming. Thanks, Ed. So my focus is basically the hands-on work, the restoration. I come from the trades, and then this is just kind of my passion. Live in Mount Vernon, and just new to the commission.
The new edition,
All right.
Tree Sunnyside edition.
But it doesn't show up on the screen.
See, well, I got this somewhere. I don't know where it's.
So first things I'll just kind of get out of the way is just safety concerns. Don't want to dwell on lead paint. I think we're all pretty familiar with that. Just use proper protection when you're around that. Structural integrity, just be aware. We'll mention again a little bit about the rough. Sun garage is a little bit of concern. Obviously height and how you work with the roof. we're gonna basically talk about the columns. One of my areas that I probably made every mistake, so I've learned some of the things hard way, but one of the things that I've always overlooked, and this is, everybody has a different way of looking at this, is I really now do assessments a lot more. At first, I could just go see the rot and just go, like, why are we even talking about this? Let's just start doing it. But for a porch, you really want to look at the whole system. Really look at your fall, look at your roof lines, check your piers, get that done. You don't want to fix something incorrectly or waste your time. At least that's the way I look at it now. It's just me. I don't have a crew. If I make a mistake, I've lost that time. So, and then one thing I'd say is, when you do that, when you're looking at the whole project, don't overlook a temporary repair. I'll show you some pictures here as we go through. Sometimes there's like a thing like, I'm not going to do anything until I can spend my time fixing it. But in a porch, in my opinion, there's a lot of critical things you should do today. They'll really save you some time, even if it's ugly, even if it's temporary. But that can be part of your plan. So when you do an assessment, these are all, I didn't have to leave Mount Vernon to get any of these pictures. You're going to want to evaluate underneath, because this support, if there's no sense that this to the roof are all integral, obviously. So this has to be fixed before this. You want to see what your problems are. I mean, when you evaluate, a lot of times you'll get to, kind of be an 80-20 rule. You'll get to a corner, and this one will be where the gutter was at or something, and this is really the one that's pulling down the porch. So just a whole assessment of the porch, and you can do a lot yourself. If you know people or have a contractor or have another set of eyes, sometimes that third-party eyes is pretty nice. I have some brother-in-laws that are contractors, and they'll tell me anything. They'll just, where sometimes you kind of want to hide that or go into it. And then this is where I come in. I'm just a restorationist. I'm a restorationist, so I don't look at anything any different. I'm always repairing what's there. I don't look to see what I can change in product or anything. I really want, I'm not going to sit there and try to figure out, can I change this or that? I want to find out what was original, and then that's just easy for me. I don't have to sit there and go, is my column big enough, or that's original, it's already designed. I just go. So I can't speak much to a lot of changes. And then, so that's one reason to restore is you don't have to worry about it. You've got an old house, you've done it right, in my book. Old growth wood, cost effective, obviously. Porch columns, we all know what, I mean, why buy new columns if you can use the old ones? Let's see. Historically correct, obviously not. Now that said, this porch, you could go get columns and you could restore that porch. You'd have something to work with there. So old growth wood, I just want to speak on that in the fact that it's a dense wood, so stronger, harder, and where it comes into play on columns is it's a stable wood. So if we're looking at, I don't know if we can see green on, yeah. So if we look at this, I think I have one. Okay. So ring count is what you're looking at. So with an old growth wood, can you imagine? I mean, those days are gone. Look how fast growing we're processing trees now. So when you start doing counts, you know, when I did some restoration work, I had to do some little pulley work, and they were really concerned about count. I used to work at Brucemore, and you know, you need 22 rings to an inch. You really want to get that. And once you start getting that, the stability is what you really want in a porch column. You know, so it keeps it stable. You aren't doing that movement, and those rings are what you're looking for. But I think that's one part that's overlooked because it's just not official. You know, people, you know, but there really is a point to it. So, as Ed spoke, parts of a column, you got your capital to spread the load at the top, shaft, base, width, 2 pieces down the bottom. So column types. You're going to run into as Ed talked about, solid columns, and then you've got square columns that are hollow. Sometimes they can have a shaft in them. You don't run across many laminated columns, but there'll be just a laminated solid piece. And then I didn't bring a column in, but a lot of stave columns is what we see. That's probably the one we're most familiar with. So when you do your evaluation, if you have to do a lot of work on a column, it really behooves you to remove it, because that crack just doesn't lend itself to a repair vertical. You can work on it, but it's pretty tough to set adhesives and do banding when it's up, and it's just simple when it's down. So I don't know if anybody's familiar, but these are jacks you use for porch jacks, and they're cheap, straightforward. You just simply, this is where you get the distance at the top. And like this is a short one. These a lot of times are used under porches, and then you can get them 8 foot tall, and you know. But then go ahead and put something temporary up there. If you pull it, I usually put 2 or 3 2x4s together, and then I always nail them at the top. You're going to find if you have an old porch, a lot of times there isn't much there. I mean, you don't want to jack much, but you know, it doesn't take anything to just get that column free. But nothing to work with. You know, those can fall out pretty easy. So most of the work is done at the base, like I mentioned. It's where the moisture's at. It's those are the parts that take the beating. It's low. It's on the outside. So the types of bases. So this is a plank base. So these are just a solid piece of wood. So this is just cut out of a 2x12. The problem with that is that, and this pieces. Anyway, so you've got end grain. So usually what they do is, I'll have some pictures here, but picture frame it so that you can hide that end grain, cover that end grain up. So this one's a picture frame to it. And so this end grain is protecting itself. You can start to see failures, but you know, as opposed to having the whole area. But this, you can start to see the crack here, and a lot of times it's what's happening is that stress crack is because that porch is shifted. You might have some rot down below, and that's where that stress is coming out and cracking it. The glue wasn't as good then either. That's why they're really lend themselves to be repaired. So Dutchman repair is just a wood repair. So if you had a partial, let's see, do I have, okay. So I have a porch on here I did, Chris Andrews' porch. So he had a square column, and one side he had boxes that were rotten. So pretty simple fix. Just simply a scarf cut. You know, some degree, pick it 30 to 45, whatever. And so if this was the rotten part, let's say the bottom was rotten, I just line up and cut them off. Once again, I pull the columns. It's just so easy to pull the columns and do it in the shop. It's pretty simple work. And then I just do this scarf cut, bring that in, and you can make that line disappear. And so that the square columns are simple to fix. Same with a solid column. Like this would be like just the base of your column. Just there's going to be your cut. Just do 2 scarf cuts, and then they just wedge in. They're going to hold each other, and then you can still, glue it, screw it. You could set an anchor in there and epoxy over them. You can make that disappear. But that's a simple cut to make. And then one thing I'd note is don't ever throw away anything, and this kind of comes with your assessment. Like if you've got a couple of these that are bad on your porch, really do some calculations, because you can put this cut anywhere in there. And so sometimes what I'll try to do is I'll do the cut and use this piece for my repair on the other one. Then that one's a slam dunk. Then this one I have to get some oversized piece of wood, do the cut, plane it down, get it back. Because usually that's what you end up doing, is Ed mentioned, you're going to have to find some oversized piece. You either have to go to a mill or step up. I mean, you're not going to go out there and just find a piece that fits. But that's just kind of something to keep in mind. Like if you have to sacrifice a porch column, man, hang on to that maybe. Use it for your other repairs, maybe something like that. So column reuse. One thing I always do is, like my steps on my finish is, I always use a preservative. Well, let's talk about epoxies. One thing about that I'd say is, I basically use Arbitron. I've used some other West products. Do make sure that you're comfortable that the product you're using is for wood. And the reason I say this, especially in columns, is there's some really good products out there, but they can be like if you do a stave repair, like so 3 Type Bond 3 is a wood glue. Now you could do that with an epoxy repair, but you can make that repair too strong. And so if you've got a product that's really, this is kind of running the market, kind of stood the test of time. There's others out there, but just make sure that they've considered, or at least you're comfortable with the fact that that's going to move with the wood. You want something that kind of matches the wood. You can put something in there that's stronger than the wood, and you could get a break. I mean, don't know how big an issue that is. I just stay safe and make sure that I've got a wood product. I don't go to some other category and pull from the steel market and say, oh, it's a steel epoxy, it'll work. And I'm not a chemist, so I'm not going to try to figure that out. But I just stay with what's safe. a step that I have added to myself, I found this kind of through working with some people that took care of like long-term historic properties. And I always use a preservative in my steps of repair now. So if I was to do a porch column, I'd take all the paint off, wash it down, get all the waxes off. I wouldn't use any cleaners. And then I always coat with a clear preservative that's paintable. This is just what I use. There's others out there, but you just gotta make sure it's paintable. I have sprayed that inside columns too. Just going to spray. It goes on like water. And I always think the reason painters don't use it, it's another day. It's another dry cycle, and it's another truck roll. I mean, who wants to do that? But for us, it pays dividends. Okay, I don't know how familiar you are. These are borite tablets, and I use tablets. I don't use a preservative. I don't use a liquid. So if let's say I was doing an epoxy repair where I'm going to grind out all the rod. I'm just going to go in and take that rod out and just fill it with epoxy. What I do is I would drill holes for these pellets. I drill it in and I go up past that repair point. And I'd set those pellets in there. And what that does is that's going to, if you ever get moisture back in there, you're going to miss some of that decay. That reactivates it. That's going to kill it. And the reason I use pellets and the reason I'm just not comfortable with, I've seen too many of the liquid and soak it in liquid more, then I get paint failure. And in my book, if I really worked hard at doing a good Dutchman or really grinding out that rod, my pellet's just like insurance, you know, especially if I do something for somebody else, you know. It's like, they're a little hard to find. You see it all out there in liquid all the time. Type 1-3 is usually what I use. There's some other stuff, but it's an exterior. One thing to keep in mind when you're looking at your porch is, kind of reminds me of my old car I have. You know, I talked to the guy about the engine, and he goes, "You know, that's probably not your original engine." And, you know, in my mind, you know, I thought, never thought of that. He said, "That's probably your third engine that's in that car." This is kind of the case when you document it. You're still going to have to, my guess is, Ed can maybe correct me, that might not have been the profile. That might not be the original block. You know, just doesn't feel right. You know, doesn't have a good radius to it. That's something to keep in mind a little bit is, you know, if I'm looking something on my house, if it doesn't feel right, the more you're around old houses, it's just a small thing, I guess I'd say, is I'd love to have these columns dropped off in my garage, you know, give it a good radius. You know, they sit on Lincoln Highway. They're very prominent. I walk by them every day. I'd love to have them. And see, you can kind of see how that column's torqued a little bit, showing that pressure crack. And then if you get lucky, you know, that style of porch, like Ed was talking about, man, you're dealing with square lumber here. You're home free in my book. You know, man, you could repair all those, or you can just strip them. And now this doesn't deal with lead paint. One of the problems I think we saw the, let's see, we'll go back. Anyway, there's one I had on there, paint. One reason you want to take all the paint off in my book is, number one, you want to see all the, if you're doing if you've got a stave column, you want to see all the joints. So just strip it in my book. And then also, the vapor molecule is going to push out through the side. So I don't know exactly what the number is. It's 0.025, 0.023 or something. And then also there's a factor of lead paint and alkaline paint. You get lead paint and alkaline paint, you got a waterproof paint. So, people that scrape paint, they're always going, why are you taking all the paint off? Because I want one continuous layer that moisture molecule drives through. Critical on these. Okay, you don't want to do it on your house or something, fine, but that's why paint pops. When you see paint pop, that's moisture pushing that off of there. So it's not about, in this case to me, not like a window. For a window, you're looking at lead dust because you got friction points, right? So you're going to look at lead problems there. A lead problem on the outside, I don't know, whatever. But you are dealing with too thick a paint. So, I don't know, it seems like a simple thing to me. And just part of a repair process, an inspection process, it's nice to see the whole column. So, one thing this is my house, this is my porch, is you can't really notice this from the street. I got a little kickback when I did this. Keep your plants away from your porch. Let your house breathe. Don't trap moisture. So I probably did a little overkill here, but I made sure my fall was away from the porch. Just when I came in, I just tore everything out, got my fall away from the porch, and I'm kind of lucky because I'm a corner lot, so I just came in and I just put an ADS pipe, put it around it, and drained it to the curb. But it stays dry. And then I just religiously walk through here and just mow that down back there. But from the street, you can't tell that's there. At least in my book. I don't think most people would know that I have a gravel walkway around my porch. Plus, it lets me have access. I mean, how else are you going to, check on it and keep track of it? This kind of gets back to Ed's point about the house. So these are identical houses. This is Dan and Sheila. This is Shepley's old house on the south end of town. I think Charles Davis was the contractor, built around the same time. I always kind of wondered, he came back, took the flat roof off, captured the roof. So my son had a window and Ben didn't have a window in his bedroom, and but they're identical. And then notice he changed, but that's kind of what it was, right? You picked out of the catalog a little bit and said, what kind of finish do I want? And it's kind of interesting to see he has half column, they're identical layouts. The first time Ben ever came over to the house, he stepped inside the house. I think he was probably a third grader, and he just goes, "This is like my house." It's that similar. I mean, fireplace in the same place there. But it's kind of neat to see the difference in the porch. I have to deal with a low sloped roof. I ice barrier the whole thing when I rebuild it. This is the bummer, this is around the corner. Used to sit a little porch here, rough, man, that's, you don't want to lose those. Okay, you can start to see some failure points. This would be a plank one. Just that ingrate, you can see the grain run. That's what you're going to get. And see, And depending how this is tacked down, that nailing, if there's movement and it's nailed too much wrong grain, it's going to pull apart. It's going to crack it. Same this, boy. And this is when I say temporary repair, man. The last thing you want to do is start dropping your roof. And like Ed mentioned, you can't jack up a roof. I should have taken the picture of the back porch. My back porch was a small porch, and it had a lot of failure. I mean, that roof was sloped. So I had to take all the roofing off, expose that top, and go in there. It was 2-3 inches. It pulled. So it pulls out. What happens is, right, it pulls from the top, it pivots out. So what happens is, you jack that up, that doesn't go back in. It pulls the bottom out. You're essentially pushing your roof off your house. So what I had to do is I go in there, cut all those free, clean that all up, slowly jack it up, went inside, tore all the plaster off, put a header in there, and then bolted that as we slowly jacked it up and pulled it back to the house. Got it perfect, wagged it in. And that's one thing I'll say is, along that, if you're moving anything, be slow. Like if you got to lift your porch a little bit, figure out how you're going to lift it so you aren't lifting your roof. You might have to have 2 jacks and bring one down while if you've got to correct a rotten pier. Go slow. Like maybe you let it set a day. Don't try to get all of it back right away.
Duane, I was going to say, like, we was talking about that sag, even on a floor joist in your house. If you got an old house, a lot of times there's a little sag in there, and you can restore it, but you don't want, that's a permanent deformation. It's called creep. And if you try to push all that up at once in the middle, it's going to push the ends up. Now you can correct it, but you got to take one of those things there, and maybe a quarter of a screw every couple of months. You got to reverse that process, and then you'll have to keep that support underneath there, because otherwise it'll come right back there.
And we live in old houses. We know what it's like. I mean, we can live with that. We don't have to get it back to perfect. I mean, that's what you kind of have to figure out with porch. Like, what am I living with? Is what am I trying to correct? Can I compensate for the wrong? This porch I caught down in Pella. You could stand taking this paint off, but pretty nice. You can do that on your base. Now, maybe Ed can speak to this. Like a lot of the guys I follow, some in the trades. This guy, there's another guy down in Florida, and what I've noticed is, like, some guys are really hardcore about venting columns. I don't know that we have that issue in our. So the one, I guess the caveat I'd say to that is, if you are going to follow somebody, like I kind of do, is like I go, it's kind of like planting a plant. You go, okay, it's okay if it's in Minnesota, it will work here, that kind of thing. So just make sure that maybe his technique is that he's not from Mississippi, or where he has to deal with humidity and condensation points. Try to stay in your zone, I guess that I'm saying. And, but there's guys that vent them. They'll vent columns. And then some of them, the way they'll vent that bottom is they'll do a picture frame that, so this will be hollow with those vents underneath, and then this will have a hollow. So that'll be the hole at the bottom, and then they'll just either go in on the inside of the porch in the capital and try to drill into there, which is structurally a little questionable. I haven't seen that problem. So that's a square column repair that I did, that I kind of showed you the scarf pad. Let's see, am I done? Maybe that's where I ended. What other things did I say about it? I'll go over some other points of maybe your interest. Number one, I do a lot of heat plate work. There's a Cobra heater out there. It's an infrared that would even be better, but I can't afford it for myself. I don't use a heat gun a lot. I don't like the fan. I don't like the spot heat. A little hard. This is a little easier for me to control. Epoxies. I don't know if everybody's familiar with epoxies. What's nice about Arbitron is they're one-to-ones. They're set up that way, so you don't have to do any calculations or use any different, it's an ounce to an ounce. I mean, so when you mix it, mix it. The only tip I'd say in there is, make sure you mark your lids. Don't ever mix your lids up. That's painful. And then when I mix, I'm always pretty hardcore about when I've measured and I put in my container and I mix it up. Once that's mixed up, I take that stick, throw it away. I take that container, and I pour it into another container. And I move that container because I don't want anything that's, this stuff's really thick and viscous, and unless you really know the color, so sometimes I just had too much a little tacky on there. And then I always keep what I use, what's left. I always try to mix over to make sure that I'm not double batching. If I'm going to do a repair, I want enough to do the repair. I don't want to come in and marry up another coat to it. That's probably just my personal preference. But then I always keep that container. The next morning when I come out, I check it. And when you use the putty, same thing. I want that little golf ball size, and I'm set. I don't, is it froze? Is it, is it old product? Whatever. I just verify that product.
For the heat plating, what's the purpose of the heat plating?
Strip wood. So strip paint.
Okay.
Yep. So just strip. This is, one thing I'd say is, if you can, leave, this is an old Porch part. So what I do is I have a box out in the garage and I just throw all that stuff in there. It's nice to be able to, somebody's going to be in your house in 100 years, you aren't going to be there, maybe the next guy. It's nice to go back and get that profile. Because that's my replacements. At this point, I get close. I mean, I'm not going to sit there. George Washington didn't sleep in my house, so, but you don't want to keep changing it like that other column over time. It'd be nice to, I usually write on it and say, this is why I took it out. Might be the original, Now, here's the way I approach this. These pieces, the base, I look at throwaways. I try my best, but I look at throwaway. So, I would picture frame a base like this to get rid of my end column, so my end grains. I'd picture frame it. It's a little problematic because you do have 4 joints, and you got to do those right. You got to get them tight, but you can do. I'm not saying that. If you notice, this is my original one, but you can see that's what they did there. So that was, they essentially did a picture frame block, right? And then they cut a circle, right? And so they had no end grain. no end grains, right? But then see where it failed. I mean, it still failed on the joint. And you got a lot of those. So here is another approach, and this is kind of because of new products. So this is just solid block of wood. I just turned these, I just spun them out on the turning lathe. Doesn't really matter. I think I used, this may be poplar. And then I plasticized them. So I just totally, sometimes I heat these up. If you're doing this, little tip, get the sucker hot. Because when you use that epoxy and then as that cools down, that'll suck that stuff in there. That'll suck it down those tubes, those end grains. So this has end grain on it, right? But I've plasticized it. So that's kind of my trade-off. But then also, when I do it, my work, well, I just made another 6. I mean, I'm already set up, you know. So I have 6 of these sitting up in the garage. I got 6 more bases, you know. You've done the work, you know, just, that, you know, the setup time and getting the woods, 90% of your work is making the base or whatever is pretty simple and straightforward. So, all right. Do you have any other questions? I wish I had another picture here. There was the column beside this. I must have missed that picture. I looked and it has 3 pieces of 2 by 1200. Correct thing to do. It's the corner one, it's dropping. It's a Cornell building. But at least he came in and did that and kept that porch roof from falling. He's kept the same height of the roof, and he's letting that corner of the porch is what's failing on him. But you know, you don't want that. So the temporary fix was good on that.
Duane, you have a recommendation, if you use wood for your floorboards,
Yeah.
you always have an end grain exposed, and of course the water comes down and that just sucks up water. Do you treat those?
Here's the thing, I look at that. This is kind of my approach, and I don't know that it's, I still struggle with it a little bit. It's kind of like saying, what do I like to, it's kind of like saying like a basement. If you can't keep the water away from your basement walls, you better be drilling holes in your wall and figuring out how to pump it out because of the pressure. So if you can't keep it dry, you got to make sure. Let's say you take a solid column like this. I could dry that. You got to be sure that you want to do that. You know, is that a moisture issue? So the question is, so water, so these are like drinking straws, right? So just envision I grabbed a whole set of drinking straws. So I'm a wood turner. So I've always marveled at when they've cut a tree down, you can actually pour water out of some wood. It's just amazing. And so as a wood turner, we stop that right away, as fast as we can. We seal up that wood. If somebody comes to me and says, you know, I'm cutting Grandpa's cherry tree down, I want a rolling pin, seal that wood up. And you seal that up, and you want that moisture molecule to leave through the side. You want to slow that process down so it doesn't just all at once leave and then give you all those checks and cracks. So you want to slow it down. So kind of keep that in mind when you're sealing up wood, is like the edge of a porch. You got to watch, you know, because if you get water any other place, that's where it's trying to dry out, and it dries out quick. You know, you don't want to trap. You don't want to trap. Like when you do any caulking or anything, you know, like what happened here? You know, by, you know, it's sitting there wet. You know, wood's going to get wet, but like one thing that happens in columns is that they noticed was like a column would get a hole in it and then it'd quit rotting. Well, yeah, because now it can dry out. It'll rot into that stave, and then you'll have airspace in there. And then once it's in there, decay's done, it's dry. It can dry out. So don't trap moisture. I don't have an answer on everything on that, but I kind of worry about, ooh, do I want to seal this up, or am I really, it's kind of like storm windows, right? Ooh, don't paint that bottom. That's how that moisture's getting out of that wood. I'll get some window work, and it's good. Ooh, you painted too much. You're sealing up. Wood has to breathe, has to dry out, and that's where I get back to that thin coat of paint, even coat of paint, so we can expand, contract, and that vapor molecule can move through it. I have that with my other. See, that kind of gets back to my, if you want to do a picture frame, it's good, but that's kind of like that. It's good. I mean, and then I will say that I've seen a combination where they'll do a plank, but then they'll just picture frame around it. So then that piece here covers your whole end grain, and you could epoxy that one on. Then you just have little short end grains, and those would be pretty sacrificial too.
So what do you do with the seams as those start to split a little bit?
Yep, good question. Thanks for bringing that up. So essentially what I do is, like, if I was going to get this column, if they would say, Duane, will you fix the column? First thing I come do is I put bang clamps on this. I just clamp it up, jack it up, and let me tell you, there isn't much there. You get that out. It's also on maybe the nails up through, just get a big blade on it. It's also at the top of the capitals. Get the blade in there. There's some nails up there. There isn't going to be much here. Should be a sheet of lead or something between the masonry so it doesn't just wick up moisture here. But I get that off. I build a cradle for them to sit in the shop. So I just have a wood cradle. Just take a radius and clamp that up. And then I totally strip it, right? Strip it. And then I really work on those cracks on getting that clean, because this is what happens. This is what I see happening. Is I'll get a column, and they will have painted the dickens out of it, and then this just triggers it. So what they do is they fill that one way or another. They fill it. But it's not glued together. So water gets in there, and then when it tightens up, then it just pushes it apart because they put a wedge in there. So it just keeps pushing it apart. It just makes it worse. So you really have to work at getting that really clean. So I do air hoses. I just clean it all out. And once I clean it out, then I do a dry fit. I see, what do I have here? And you'd be surprised, they'll go back. They'll go back together. And, a lot of times you aren't working, I'm not sitting there just working with pieces. I'm working with a column, and I'm just having to deal with, this crack looks pretty long. But I don't have to do it. So I clean that out. I've got it all clean. I've got it sitting in a cradle, and I'm comfortable with pulling it back together. That I'm back. Then I open it up, and like I said, this is when you really want to, it's nice to work horizontally. A lot of times what I'll do is, if I'm using Tide Bond, if I'm not using a West system or something, I'll run that glue down there. Now, you got to watch your set times. If you're working alone, sometimes it's nice to have an extra hand because you are trying to do clamps and you're trying to pull it up. I'll get glue down there, and sometimes I'll leave an air hose down in there to make sure I get around. I don't mind it dripping off on the inside. You can see. Make sure you get good penetration. You can't put too much glue on. get her down in there, and then I clamp it back, and I'll only do one at a set time. I don't try to do, I'm just asking for trouble to try to do one. I'll fix this one, right? Then I'll have, this will be fixed. Then the next day, I'll fix that one. You know, once I have that solid piece, then I'll just work my way around. But I've never been ambitious enough. I know guys that have done more than I've done, you know, they're good, you know, they're Coopers or something, you know, they can do the whole barrel at the same time. Wow, I can't. You know, it's just, I go slower. And then you're just back to finishing the column. You can do whatever you want then. You know, it becomes cosmetic. I mean, you can make a column perfection. You know, if you want to, there's different products that, you know, different fillers and things like that that are good to go. And then I guess one thing I'd say about, I don't want to get into paints or finishes. I work with a painter. I mean, work with a paint store. You know, I guess that'd be the stuff I'd tell you. Don't go to a box store. You know, go to somebody, unless you've got, you know, your paint knowledge and what it is. You know, those guys have helped me out a lot. You know, I'm not into figuring out paint that they'll go use this kind of paint for the outside. And then I guess my other tip is I never mix products. And in that regard, if I go with Benjamin Moore, I'm going with, somebody's got to really tell me why I don't go with Benjamin Moore primer. And I want those products talking to each other. So, looks like I'm done. So, any other questions? Happy to answer them. Try.
When you put those vents in for the humidity, you were showing a picture, does that compromise the structural integrity of the column at all?
Putting in vents.
Yeah.
That's why I'm a little leery of, probably not in that size. I mean, if you were going to vent, I think I'd do, like you saw, cut the vents in on the base, and at least do that in the bottom. And then you're going to have to watch for insects. You're going to have to put some screening on there. And then, you know, I just haven't seen the need for that. Because one thing I always kind of, I don't want to make a worse problem. And then, you know, I mean, you calculate, I mean, by the time you got these little vents in here, you got to have a pretty big hole to move air. That's not like it's, you know. But I just wanted to mention there are guys that, there's areas that definitely, they're hardcore about venting their columns. I mean, they vent every column. But columns I've seen, I just haven't seen it. What I see is rot down at the bottom. It's just, you know.
This is more of a style question though, but so many of them don't have railings for the stairs.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, you get old houses and people can't go up the stairs very well anymore. Are there specific styles that, I mean, you see a lot of different, you know, that one person just slapped some iron stairs on there, some basic, like, would you want to try to match the railing to the stairs?
If you've got a baluster, chances are the rail at one point is the same style.
Yeah.
And that's another thing about balusters is don't use a flat 2x4. Most balusters and all,
Yeah.
they have a little profile
Oh,
to
yeah.
them.
Yeah.
Again, for drainage.
Yeah.
Water is your enemy
Yeah.
in a porch.
Yeah.
Or anything for that matter.
Well, so did they used to mostly have railings and those railings have just been taken off? Because there's a lot of houses that don't have.
I would say they probably had, the steps probably aren't originally either in many cases.
True.
I do know historically, like Iowa City,
And I found the old balustrades up in the.
you know, there's some of that stuff that they've done it so long, it becomes almost historic. And that's where you talk about the iron pipe.
Yeah.
And that almost is invisible. you know, it doesn't distract from the house,
The same style.
and that's become, I know in some parts that's pretty acceptable.
See, ours had square.
On the back porch, I wouldn't mind so much, but on the front, that.
Yeah.
Like something.
Somebody had
yeah,
changed
fine,
it.
Yeah.
position that matches.
The original.
Build the whole thing from the
Yeah.
start.
Yeah. Yeah.
Balustrade.
Yeah, well, if you drove by my house, I'll just admit, we have the exact reverse. We had round and around, and my back house wraps balusters down the back, that's the side of the house.
Yeah.
And the front, I put in iron pipe, and you can see the difference. But it's a matter of preference.
Right.
There's be railing somewhere, so.
Yeah,
So that people can't use the stairs to get into the house.
So I'm kind of sad that he left, but he has a radius corner on his porch. And I noticed a very similar type of construction. He has original built-in gutters.
I think so.
yeah.
Is there any tradespeople around that restore those anymore? Because we have had we have a radius
Yeah.
corner wraparound porch, and we've been searching for about 3 years, and there is not a tradesman out there that's
Can't
willing to
find
tackle that.
Yeah, this is what I can speak to, because everybody always asks me that when I do that. And oddly, there's just not guys that do it. I don't know what it is. I think one thing, I'll put it this way. The girl that I worked with, she was young, she was out of restoration school out of Ohio. And she went to Florida to do windows. I mean, it just, you know, it just doesn't pay here. You know, I don't know. You've got to find somebody that wants to do it, is really what it is. Because I don't know if we really don't want to pay the price that it is. Because a lot of times what I hear is, this is kind of the confusing thing to me, is I can't find anybody that knows how to repair wood windows. Are you kidding me? This is not rocket science. We're dealing with small amounts of wood here. This is, you know, this is more, we have people that just don't do that. You know, because, I mean, think about replacing a window. Come on. That's not easy work either. I mean, so, just, I don't know, it just seems like the old crafts, number one, new things are set up for time, right? It's, how quick, one truck roll, I want one truck roll, I want in, and I want out. And, you know, we'll pay you $100 an hour, and let's see how fast we can do it. And so that drives a lot of those solutions. You know, I looked around, you know, when I did the presentation on windows, I went back to my old guys and, you know, really, don't do that anymore. Don't do them. You know, we just, you know, so I don't have much help for you.
Fair
You know,
enough. Fair enough.
I mean, Sarah's down, the girl I worked with, she was excellent, she was young, passionate, you know, she's getting $1,200 a window. You know, and all the windows she can do down there. You know, so we're gonna pay $1,200 a window? Nope. Nope, not in Iowa. The reason, one thing I'd say is, if you're handy, you know, I mean, wood's wood, you know, so he does wood gutters. I mean, he covers that. John, I don't know.
Yeah.
And
And a month off
Yeah.
of vacation time and.
Yeah, that's it.
And the new garage workspace.
And, yeah, you
Yeah.
gotta build a new garage.
Yeah,
Make some mistakes.
Learn how to do it, and then there'll be
Right,
somebody
learn how
that
to
knows
do
how
it.
to do it.
yeah,
Look all the money you can make.
yeah. I know, see, when I started, my house is right on the corner. So, you know, I'd come home and I'd literally have a porch column laying in my driveway. You know, you need to fix this, you know, so I feel people's pain, you know.
Are there other, I guess, this is the first I've ever heard of the Mount Vernon Historical Preservation Society. Do you guys have like a list of people who do Like just for.
We have just started talking about that.
Okay.
And the reason, Ed can speak to why we're required to have that, because we have historic districts.
Yeah.
So that's why we're required to have the commission.
Oh, yeah.
Because,
Our website used to have lists of contractors who may do certain types of work, as well as certainly a lot more resources to go to find out
Yeah.
how to do it. But I don't know whether that's been kept up to date or not, but we used to have that.
you could check with Iowa City,
Good.
kind of like similar to this book. I think in the back of this book, he lists resources, you know, by state.
Yeah.
That's a little sketchy.
Mhm.
But, you know, the one window guy I knew in Iowa City, I think he's done.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think he does it anymore. But they had a book when I did a house in Iowa City before I moved to Mount Vernon, and they had a little book, and they had their resources in the back there. You know, people that they kind of signed off on,
Yeah.
because that's part of it,
Yeah.
right? You want somebody that wants to work on your house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we asked once at the salvage barn down there.
Yeah.
I think they haven't, or they pointed us to the Iowa City Historical Preservation, and they didn't.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Do they have a Facebook page, Iowa City?
I
It might, could be worth
Yeah.
noting, like, if you could find a Facebook page, then you
Yeah.
could maybe just ask,
Yeah.
yeah.
said you want to do this type of service.
Yeah.
It might
Yeah,
might get around, you never know.
Yeah, I just haven't found, there's just not a lot of guys out there. Yeah.
Yes, he's so close.
Be
I
surprised
know,
who reads
but
some
they
of that
don't even,
stuff.
they like make
They
everything
don't.
new now.
Yeah.
Like we started watching that even, and they're like, oh, we'll just make, like it's, they're not keeping it old.
Yeah. I came, right across the street from me, I wish I would have brought that sample in, kick myself for that, is, I came home one day, they had one rod, they had a little rod on one porch column. And they had 4 columns, and they were solid wood. So if you think of a solid wood column, amazing. You know, because so that's solid wood. If this was the tree,
Yeah.
right, if this was a tree, that whole column was cut out over here. So if you saw a porch column, then you can double that and then take out the heart. We're talking a tree. 100% tight ring. Old growth. You know, not a knot in it. You know, that wood is gone. All of them were laying at the curb for that one rod in the corner that could have been fixed. And they just simply said, couldn't find anybody to fix it. And then of course, when you've got that guy there that, you know, it's kind of like going, you want to have surgery? Go see a surgeon, right? I mean, if you want, whatever that guy does is what he's going to say, I'll put in all new columns. I mean, they're in, they're good. They're the new fiber, you know, but, you know, and if you got money to do that, I don't, you know. I fix my columns perfectly, and they'll last another 100 years. And it just cost me, like what, $10, $20?
Time.
Yeah. Yes, I am kind of hardcore about that.
That's the.
Like when people always ask me, how long does it take to do a window? And I said, oh, about half a Netflix series. I mean, I don't know what other time, but just saying. Okay,
All right, thanks for coming.
thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.